Hey, Deja.
Hi.
How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing great. Let me go start the one in the Lee Jensen room. They're working hard. They haven't even looked up. All right, you guys, it's time for the amendment. Hi. Imani. Hey, can you start the Zoom up there? I'm going to be here so I can use my downloads. And where are the downloads? I sent them to your email. Email, all right. All right, guys, I'm getting ready to jump on. Let me just get my downloads ready so we can talk through the exhibits individually. All right, so cash. How's everybody doing today? Hey, Siri. Happy New Year.
Hi, Authurine. Happy New Year.
I have not seen you in what they say, a month of Sundays. Everything's good?
Yes, everything is good. I'm just slowly trying to get back.
All right, cool. Well, I'm glad to see you on. Oh, great. Everybody's on. Can you guys hear me up front in the lead gen room? Can you unmute them? All right. Can you hear me okay in there? All right, great. So I want this to be more of a conversation, right? And not really a very formal class. So please free to ask me questions. I think you guys are on mute. So I'm gonna split the class up in two different segments. So we'll do exhibits from 11 to up to 11:30, and then we'll do with the amendments, right? So if you all are familiar with the purchase and sale, which you should be, on page 7, which is this page, you have choices of different amendments, right? I mean, different exhibits. Okay, so I'm gonna go through a couple of the exhibits, some of the ones we use most frequently. So I'm gonna go through the cash exhibit, the closing attorney acting as holder of earnest money exhibit, the conventional loan, all of the loan exhibits, I'll go through that. Of course, I'm gonna go through the lead-based paint exhibit, the sale or lease of buyer's property contingency exhibit, because that's becoming a hotbed problem nowadays. I'm gonna go through temporary occupancy agreement for seller after closing and VA loan exhibit. I'm not gonna go through community association disclosure exhibit because most people should be familiar with that one, and the seller's disclosure. What I will say for both of those, both the community, otherwise known as the CAD disclosure, F322, and the seller's disclosure, exhibit F301. As the seller's rep, you can't touch those forms. You should not be filling those forms out. Anybody know why?
Which form again? Say that again.
The community association disclosure and the seller's property disclosure. You should not be filling those forms out. You should not touch those forms. Do you know why?
The seller should be filling out the seller's disclosure, and the community disclosure should come from
the HOA people or the seller themselves as well, right?
Okay, and why aren't you filling those out? Because I've seen agents fill them out before. So why should
Because I don't want to be responsible for filling it out incorrectly, and then I'm held accountable for something that was miscommunicated on the status of that house.
All right, especially for the seller's disclosure. Have you lived in that house?
Nope.
Okay, right. So that's why we do not fill out the seller's disclosure. I don't care if they're like my mom, who's 90 and don't use a computer. You know what? Print it up and take it over there. Okay. All right. So let's start with the all cash sale exhibit, and I am going to share my screen. Can everybody see my screen? Yes, can you see the cash sale exhibit?
Yes.
All right, so here's something I want you guys to write down. Exhibits are letters and amendments are numbers. So this, if this was the first one I'm using, which actually it is the first one under 8 on the exhibits, I would put A up here. And so exhibits are made a part of the contract. You guys understand that? Exhibits are a part of the contract. Because if I just presented them 8 pages of a purchase and sale agreement, is that enough information? Let me ask the question a different way. Okay, so I've got this great buyer and it's multiple offers, and I rush back to the office or to my computer or whatever, and I write up the offer, which is 8 pages long, and I have them sign it, and I rush it over to the seller's agent with nothing attached to it. Am I serving the best interest of my buyer?
No.
Okay. All right, so let's just get that established, because I've seen that as recently as December, right? Offer coming over to me with nothing attached, not even a pre-approval letter, because they're in a hurry. All right, so let's start with this one. So an all cash sale means what exactly?
They're coming to the table with all cash, with money, like liquidable assets to purchase the home.
Well, you would think, right, Deja?
Well, that's how I would read it. I just did a cash offer to some for a house last week, so yeah. I had statements to prove that they actually had the cash.
And that is the key right there, right? So an all cash means all cash. If you tick all cash, it means they're coming to the closing with all cash. Now, you have 2 options, right? You got A, you can cash reserves the right to buy the property with all cash money and they're not getting a loan, right? Or you can say we reserve the right to pay all or a portion of the purchase price by obtaining a first mortgage and or a private hard money loan. Now, this is very important, you guys. If you're working with an investor in quotes, and they do not have their own money, which one of these 2 would you take? The second one. The second one. Now, does that negate the fact that you need proof?
Yes.
Okay. Now, B says, we shall have the right to obtain a mortgage financing to pay for all or the purchase or full portion of the purchase price. So when I get this, an all cash exhibit, and I get somebody who has ticked off B, then my first thought is, this is really not cash. If it's the best offer, let me pick up the phone and call the agent and have a conversation, right? Because this could be just a ploy to win the deal. Understood?
It said it shall not have the right to obtain a mortgage financing, right?
Right. So in either event, if there's a shall not have the right to obtain financing for all or a portion, right? I still, whenever I get this, especially if I don't have a bank statement attached, I'm making a phone call to see where I stand. Okay, so verification of funds within, let's say, X number of days. I would say if I'm working with my buyer and I know from the buyer's consultation that they're gonna use cash, what am I asking them for?
Letter from the bank saying they have the funds available.
Yeah.
Yes. Even before we start looking, if I know you're gonna buy a $300,000 house, whatever, 500, whatever, and they're gonna pay all cash, I would like the statements in my hand so that when I'm sending over the offer, it's zero right here. And I can send the letter from the trust or the stockbroker or from whatever financial institution over with the offer. It makes a stronger offer. Does that make sense?
Yep.
All right. So please explain this part to your client. That they're giving the seller and the seller's agent the authority to follow up with the bank. Make sense? Especially in this market, and especially with certain buyers who transfer money daily from one account to the other, the seller's agent has the right to call the bank and say, hey, we just want to verify that this amount of money is in the account, okay? Any questions before I move on? Okay, no questions. And the seller shall have the right to terminate if I don't have my proof of funds attached. They have the right to terminate the agreement and go take their backup offer. If you have a day here or 2 days, if I haven't sent that letter over, that's why I'm saying get it ahead of time.
Don't get a bunch, then we can just change that, right? In front of remarks on once we get that. Okay, gotcha. All right.
What did you say, Irene?
She's out in the hallway.
Oh, she's in the hallway. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. All right. So within all right, let's say I put a day here and I haven't sent it over. By the time we go on the contract and the seller has a better offer, they can terminate because of buyer default, and they can they may or may not give the buyer 3 days to cure the default. Okay. All right. Appraisal contingency. You have an option, shall or shall not be subject to the property appraising. So here is how I would handle this with my buyer. Mr. Buyer, how badly do you want this house? Is this going to be your home for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, whatever? Based on what we check off here, we'll determine whether or not you get the house because we are up against multiple offer situations. So you can say this is not subject to an appraisal, and yet this is not excluding you from having appraisal done. Please make sure that your buyer understand that if they say this agreement is not subject to an appraisal, it doesn't mean that they cannot go get an appraisal for themselves. They just can't use this to back out. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Yes, that makes sense. Okay. Selection of appraiser. If it's not subject to an appraiser, then this is not applicable. And then of course, if it's a cash offer and it's not subject to an appraisal, then it would be 0 days here or not applicable. Any questions on this one before I go to the next exhibit that I want to cover?
Did you say you're supposed to put 0 days there if it's not subject to an appraisal?
Or not applicable.
Okay, or the NA.
Okay. All right, good. Okay, let me go. I'm gonna stop share and then share the other one. Questions on that? Anybody confused so far? All right, let's take a look at one of the other ones that we're seeing more and more and more. About 3 or 4 years ago, this one, I did not use it as much because there are lots of investors in the marketplace now. We're using the closing attorney acting as holder of the earnest money. And if you're closing with, I think, Zillow or, oh gosh, you're closing with Zillow, OfferPad, and what's the other one?
Open book.
Yes, they've got their attorney set up to hold the earnest money. So let's share that. So this one, technically, F511 has a partner, and the partner is F510, right? So F511 says the closing attorney shall act as the holder of the earnest money. The closing attorney shall act as holder. The buyer must timely deliver certain documents to the closing attorney acting as holder of the earnest money, and that it tells you what documents they want. And let me back up and say everything that we cover here, I'm just making you aware that these forms are here. I want you guys to make a note of these forms and go read them so you can explain them to your buyer. And so if you're using F11, this is very important, guys. Within 3 days of the binding agreement, you've got to have 511, Form 511 attached to that, which says, yes, the closing attorney is agreeing that they're going to hold it. Just because we're requesting that they hold the earnest money, they have to agree to hold it. And I'll bring that form up later on. It talks about the rights and the duties of the closing attorney acting as holder. And it says earnest money must be paid to the closing attorney acting as holder by wire transfer. Now, I have pushed back on this one with, I cannot remember which one it was. Zillow will not budge. I think one of the other ones, I think it might have been OfferPad. I have pushed back and said, no, we hold our buyers' earnest money. And they're like, okay, not a problem. Because right here it says alternate. The buyer must immediately notify all parties if the closing attorney fails to become the holder. The alternate holder, who must be a broker in this transaction, shall be Keller Williams Realty Atlanta North. I will always put that in here and see if they push back really hard on it. I know which ones are gonna push back really hard. I feel like it is our duty to hold our own clients' earnest money, because if there's a dispute, then we already have the earnest money. And I know the office Jim fights for our buyers. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So at all possible, when you can, hold your own earnest money. There are other companies who are not Zillow, Zillow, OfferPad, and Open Door. Like there are other companies like that will say, you know what, we want to hold the earnest money. Why would I let Remax hold my buyer's earnest money when we're quite capable of holding our own earnest money? Okay, so everybody understand this one. This one just says, here's the closing attorney, Wiseman, whoever, here's their phone number, the buyer's initial, the seller's initial, and then within 3 days, I'm gonna stop share and I'm gonna grab 511. Okay, hang on. All right, I do not have 511 loaded up. So make a note of it. And I'll just read from my copy. It says, the terms of the closing attorney acting as holder, this escrow agreement is hereby incorporated as a part of the contract, and it notifies everybody that the closing attorney is acting as holder and that they're going to put the money in their escrow account, right? Upon the closing attorney becoming holder, the time frame of the closing attorney to perform the duties of the holder shall not begin until the holder receives the signed and executed agreement in its entirety, which means the entire contract, right? So with regards to amendments to the entire contract, the rights and the duties of the holder, who's the attorney, under the amendment shall not begin until they receive the contract, right? This escrow agreement shall be interpreted in accordance with the laws of the state of Georgia, which means that we're gonna hold it in an escrow account. And if that escrow account generates interest, it goes to the holder, right? The closing attorney must agree to become holder within 3 business days. So if it's not signed off within 3 business days, Sherry might send you a little note saying, we've got to do an amendment because we got this 5 days after, right? After 511 was signed. And if the closing attorney decides that they're not going to be the holder, we already covered alternate holder. And so this one has the buyer's name, the seller's name, buyer's name, seller's name, and the closing attorney signs off on it. Any questions on 510 and 511? All right, may I move on to your conventional loan exhibit, your FHA exhibit, and then one that I really love is the lead-based paint exhibit. May I move on? Yep. All right, Rusty says yes, so we're gonna move on. Any questions so far, you guys? All right, so you know what? Let's look at the lead-based paint exhibit first, just in case we run out of time, because that's really important to me. So every time you miss one of these signatures here, it's an $11,000 fine. Okay. All right, so this has to be a part of the contract before you go binding. Let me repeat that again. The lead-based paint exhibit must be made a part of the contract where it says this exhibit pertains to that certain property known as. It must be dated the same date that you put your offer in. Any questions on that, please? No questions, right? So under federal law, this exhibit must be signed by the seller and the buyer provided with a copy of a lead-based paint brochure prior to the buyer and the seller entering into a binding agreement. This agreement must be filled out for all housing built prior to 1978. Before seller enters into a binding agreement, before buyer enters into a binding agreement. And then here's a disclosure that says, hey, all houses built prior to 1978, remember they used to use lead. Lead can harm your child. Children can be born with impaired memory, disabilities, all of that stuff. And so We know houses that were built in 1978, they have been painted and repainted. We just don't know if somebody went in and scraped off every wall. Does that make sense? So even though the house is redone, walls knocked out, looks nice and shiny and beautiful home, beautiful updated home, it's still a 1978 or prior. And so we have to give them, there's a lead-based paint disclosure in your disclosures that normally what I will do, since this doesn't require anybody to sign off on it, if I'm sending a disclosure like this to my clients, I put the little initial box on the top of it. So they initial it that they received it. Does that make sense? All right, so here's where the seller signs off, right? Seller's disclosure. All right, presence of lead-based paint and or lead-based paint initial either I or 2I below. The section not initialed is not a part of this exhibit. So this is the seller's section, you guys. So the seller is gonna initial known lead-based paint hazards are present in this house. Do you want your seller to initial there?
Oh.
All right, now. Okay, good. All right, the next place is, so A has two choices, right? The seller has no knowledge of lead-based paint and or lead-based paint hazards in the house. This is where you want your seller to initial, right? So initial point number 1, okay? All right, so now we go to B, and there is an initial required here. I had an agent just refused. Oh, we signed off on here that he has no knowledge, he doesn't have to. And so yes, they have to, right? So records and reports available to the seller, please initial either 1 or 2 below, right? Again, seller has provided the buyer with all the available records and reports pertaining to the lead-based paint in the house. Nope. Seller has no reports or records. This is where your seller initials. Make sense? Good. All right. Buyer's acknowledgement. Initial all applicable sections below. Either the buyer has received copies of all information listed above, or the buyer has received the pamphlet, Protect Your Family from Lead in Your Home. And they should, okay? Now here is the buyer's part. Buyer has initial either 1 or 2 below. Buyer has received a 10-day opportunity to conduct a risk assessment or inspection for the presence of lead-based paint in the home, right? Or buyer has waived the opportunity to conduct a risk assessment or inspection for the presence of lead-based paint in the home. This has nothing to do with the regular inspection, okay? So usually, if my buyer is not gonna hire somebody who specializes in testing the house for lead-based paint, we are initially 2. Make sense? All right, now here's your part as the seller's agent. Seller's agent has informed the seller of the seller's disclosure under, and they quote the law, and is aware of his or her responsibility to ensure compliance. So as the seller's agent, please, you must initial here. And then of course, we need all of the signatures before we go binding. All right, I know somebody have questions on this one, so let me stop share. And you guys ask me whatever questions you have on the lead-based paint disclosure. No questions, wonderful. I'm doing a fabulous job. Okay, all right. I'm sharing screen again. And for the new people, very, very new people, I just want to show you the difference between the between the conventional loan and the FHA loan. All right. So first one is conventional. This is not a government-backed loan. All right. Every time you see this exhibit is part of the agreement with an offer date off, it is strongly suggested that this goes over with the offer. If it's my listing and it's not a cash buy and this doesn't come over, whether it's going to be a conventional FHA or VA loan, and we have 30 offers, we probably are going to put this to the side and deal with the other ones. So, all right. So it says the buyer shall promptly apply for and in good faith seek to obtain the conventional loan or loans described before. So I am assuming that everybody on this call is getting their buyers pre-approved or in this market completely underwritten. So this is just a reminder, right? It's not something we're waiting to do to see if the buyer get accepted or win the offer, right? We're doing this ahead of time, and that is a yes. So I'm not going to ask a question regarding that. All right. So here's where I see a lot of agents hang up, and I want you to unmute yourself. And let me give you the scenario. The scenario is this: I have a buyer, and my buyer is putting 30% down. So what should go in here?
70%.
Okay. All right. So the loan amount is going to be 70%, right? The term, it should be on your pre-approval letter. It should say, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, congratulations. You are pre-approved or approved for a conventional loan, 30% down for 15 years or 25 years or 30 years, right? So that goes in here, 15, 25, whatever, 30 years. Your interest rate, if it does not have it on here, and I don't know why your letter wouldn't have it. Most of the time the letter will say, you know, it's 2.99%. If the loan officer says to you, well, I am not sure, we haven't locked it, the market is volatile, I do TBD right here, to be determined. Okay. It's quite okay to put TBD in here. Just make sure you have a conversation with your loan officer, because I am not a loan officer. That's not my area of expertise. Rate type, fixed. Usually nowadays it's fixed. Back in the day when I first started doing real estate, it used to be adjustable or interest only, right? So fixed, whatever the term is, have that conversation. And then source of loan terms, institutional, or if the seller is holding the loan, seller. Second mortgage loan, there are a few seconds happening. Not a lot. Back in the day when people would do 100% loan, they would do 95% or 5% or 85% of the first and then get a 15% second mortgage. All right, let's cover this quickly, right? Use of particular mortgage lender. This is just my practice. I am in no way saying you have to do this. And I'm going to read this to you and then tell you how I handle this part because it makes sense to me. So unless an approved mortgage lender is identified below, the buyer may apply for approval of a loan with any institutional mortgage lender licensed to do business in Georgia. If an approved mortgage lender is identified below, the buyer shall apply for the approval of that loan with at least one approved mortgage lender. Nothing herein shall require buyer to obtain mortgage financing from approved mortgage lender. And so you put a name here. What happens when you put a name here and they're denied, then you have to make sure that this person is the one who's sending over the denial letter. Sometimes in this business, your buyer, the The letter that's presented is not the person they end up going with, and sometimes you're the last person to know. So if they pull out, I'm like, okay, I'm gonna get that letter from Chase to say why you're denied because I'm trying to save your earnest money. Well, we didn't go with Chase. So now you're in a bind, right? Okay, so loan denial letter must be for the loan described above. So this is why I tend to leave it blank, because my buyers might still be shopping around. Does that make sense? Right? Okay, so loan denial has to be from the person up here. All right, if the loan is denied, then we have the option to apply to somebody else as long as the seller is willing to wait. All right, so remember this is a conventional loan contingency exhibit. So what do we see here? The buyer shall have X number of days from the binding agreement date to determine if the buyer has the ability to obtain the loan. Back in the day, we would see all kind of ridiculous number of days here, 30 days, 45 days. Why would you need 45 days to determine if you can get a mortgage? Makes no sense, right? Nowadays, you can do desktop underwriting. You can actually do a full underwriting. I know Silverton, Supreme, and a few others will put that client all the way through underwriting. So it's an approved loan subject to the appraisal. So I am getting a lot of offers on my listings with 0 days. I have used 0 days once to win the contract. And I used 0 days because I was extremely sure that they were approved. And how did I know that? I knew that because I used Silverton Secure, I think it is, Silverton Secure. Is it Silverton Secure? Yes. And I got a letter back saying, you are fully approved. This is not a pre-approval letter. And I had a conversation with Reed. And he said, they're solid gold, don't even worry about it, right? So the only time you should be putting 0 days in here, guys, if you are 100% and you are willing to stake your money, your earnest money, let's say it's 10,000 earnest money down. And if you're willing to stake your $10,000, you can put 0 in there. And that's just my 2 cents. A lot of people do 0 days because everybody does it, Authurine. Well, hold on a minute, right? So financing contingency, 0 days, 10 days, whatever. Nowadays, I don't think a lender needs more than maybe 10 days once they've already started to determine if they can do that particular loan or some other loan. I want us to go down to go read everything else on here. This is a conventional loan. It has an appraisal contingency, right? Let's talk about the appraisal. Let's say this comes with an appraisal contingency. The seller, this is the only offer the seller has. Nowadays, they're not accepting, they want zeros everywhere. But let's say this is the only offer they had, right? And there is an appraisal contingency. All right, what happens if it doesn't appraise? We immediately send over the appraisal to the seller's agent, and we send over the amendment to reduce sales price, right? The seller shall, not later than 3 days from the day that I send that over, decide whether or not they want to negotiate with the buyer for a lesser price. They want to terminate the contract at this point, the seller can, or they want to ask us to meet them halfway, which means, let's say the seller, the appraisal came in at, let's use 10,000. And the seller's like, you know what, I really can't afford it, that you need every dime. Let's ask them to come with 5,000 and we'll drop the contract 5,000. So they have 3 options if it doesn't appraise, right? First option is to just say, you know what, let's go. Let's reduce the price to whatever. or they can say, forget it, I have another offer, a backup offer. It's a cash offer, I'll go take that, or meet us halfway. Questions on this one?
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
So yes. I get the three options, but
Mm-hmm.
in the case where you put in as the buyer's agent an appraisal gap, do any of those options no longer on the table from the seller perspective because they're expecting you to pay the gap essentially? So their option would be only if it's reduced to a certain amount of money that they would just agree to the new price with the appraisal gap on the seller side.
So if you have an appraisal gap that fills all of that gap, Deja, then the buyer's committed to it. So let's say in this case, the appraisal gap was that $10,000. Mm-hmm. They're buying it at the price they contracted on.
Right, but let's say if it appraises under where it gives them a lower purchase price, mm-hmm. then is that seller obligated to the new purchase price based on where the gap is on the appraisal?
Okay, tell us the scenario.
So the scenario is if your purchase price is $500 and you agree to paying $15,000 above the appraised value.
Okay.
And the home appraises at $480. Then would they only pay $495? Would the seller automatically agree to the $495, or is that negotiable?
Then you're okay. So yes. Yeah.
They agree to it, or is it negotiable?
If I'm the seller's agent,
mm-hmm.
if I'm the seller's agent and this is the only contract I have in hand, mm-hmm. and my house is appraised for $480, the appraisal, I'm going to have that conversation. As a matter of fact, I'm having a conversation with the seller before. Say, look, if it comes in under 500, we have an appraisal gap, so you're good to go. Your house appraised for 480, and guess what? They're going to give you 495. Let's take it. Let's go.
Okay. That's what I wanted.
Yeah.
Okay. But that's up to the seller's agent to explain that to them, not that they have to agree to it. That's what I was trying to make sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
Authurine, I have a question.
Yeah, it's all in setting the expectations, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Got it.
I got just a quick question going back on the financial contingency.
Yes.
And you mentioned that sometimes you leave it blank of who they're going to try to get the loan through. Mm. Now, I find that all the time you can't, like, I couldn't leave it blank. Like the seller's agent would say, well, I want to know who they're getting, because if it's Bank of America, I don't want them because it's going to take forever. So do you find that it's probably better to have a company name there?
Mm-mm. I send them the approval letter.
Okay. All right.
Okay. And especially if it's Bank of, okay, let's say my clients go, oh my gosh, I want to use Bank of America because that's where all my assets are. Mm-hmm. And I go, great, let's use this letter and see if we can get a contract, right? So I send the conventional loan contingency over with this bank of approval letter. The agent called me back and said, you know what? We love this offer. You have Bank of America here. Mm-hmm. Would your client be open to getting approved through somebody else?
Right. Okay. Right. That's what happened. Okay. Yeah. Perfect. So
that's why I leave it blank. Yeah.
Okay. Super.
All right. Cool. Yeah. And then once we go on the contract, right? Well, we haven't gone on the contract yet. I can go get them pre-approved through whoever my preferred lender is, who can close in 20 days because the seller wants to go into it. And then we just switch out the letter. We don't even have to do an amendment saying we're using a different person. Because if I'm binding with Bank of America, right? If I'm binding with Bank of America and it's going south, then I have to do an amendment saying, all parties agree that we're no longer going through whoever.
Okay.
All right. All right. So let's take a quick look at the FHA contingency. All right. Share screen. And I'm watching the time to make sure. Hang on 1 second, guys, so I can plug my computer up. All right, look at the FHA contingency, and I'm gonna point out to you the major difference on here. For those who are new, for those who are experienced and have closed a bunch of loans, you already know what I'm going to point out. And the VA contingency, which I forgot to pull up, I'll explain that to you, pretty much has some of the same things. All right, so the top part is the same, right? You have a financing contingency here. Okay. All right, what is missing here? Okay. All right, so you notice that we do not have an appraisal contingency here. What we have, my friends, is a mandatory clause, right? So I'm gonna read this to you because I want you to understand what's happening, right? So this says it's expressly agreed that notwithstanding anything in this agreement, the buyer shall not be obligated to complete the purchase of the property described below, right? Or forfeit their earnest money unless the buyer has been given in accordance with HUD requirements, a written statement from HUD, or the endorsement saying that the appraised value is not less than whatever the contract price is. It goes here. Please do not leave this blank. Here's where I see agents get into trouble. We put an offer in for $450. The seller counters us at $485. We go on the contract, and guess what is still in here? $450. We forgot to change this to $485. So pay special attention to this. Whatever your last negotiated contract price is, you've got to put this in here to protect your buyer, right? Because with this one, they can just plain walk away if it's $485 and it comes in at $450 and they did not have an escalation clause, right? So buyers shall have the privilege and the option of proceeding with this contract without regard to the amount of the appraisal valuation, which means that the buyer is going to make up the difference, right? The appraisal valuation is arrived to determine the maximum mortgage that the Department of HUD will insure this for and will not warrant the value or the condition of the property. The buyer should satisfy himself in that price and condition of the property are acceptable, right? So pay attention to this. Here's something else that agents, really experienced agents, have gotten themselves in trouble for. And we had a big discussion at a team meeting recently, because agents are writing special stipulations to deal with the appraisal and to override this clause. You cannot write a special stipulation that will override the government. Let me say that again. You cannot write a special stipulations in your contract because it says up here, this FHA exhibit and the VA exhibit overrides everything in the contract. Make sense? Yes, okay, all right. So FHA upfront, FHA has an MIP, a mortgage insurance premium that the buyer has to pay for using a HUD loan. So it's 1.75 and it's usually added to the loan amount and financed. Most FHA buyers are first-time buyers and they don't have an extra 1.75 to pay at closing, right? Because this is cash money that they bring to closing, so they add it in, right? So this is 1.75 until they change it. And then buyers are aware that there's an MIP that shall be included in the regular monthly mortgage payments. All right, seller shall pay the following lender fees, tax service fees. If it's my buyer, well, That was prior to this market, right? So as a listing agent and my seller's paying some closing costs, I'm always gonna tick that these costs are included and that my seller is not gonna pay extra for this. So pay attention to this too. All right, repairs. Be very careful, you guys, to put something in here. Any repairs required in the FHA commitment shall be completed and paid for by the seller. You can put buyer in there if you're representing the buyer. I don't know why you would. So any repairs required in the FHA commitment shall be completed and paid for by the seller prior to closing, provided that such repairs does not exceed, do $1,000. It used to be $1,000. It used to be 500 to 1,000. Now I just put $1,000 in. And this again, hon, is setting the expectation for the seller. Mr. Seller, the buyer is going to pay somebody to do an inspection, right? And they're going to ask us for some inspection costs. This is not in addition to, hang on, what is going on here? Hang on, my friends, my computer is dying and I don't know why it's not charging. All right, so if we get kicked off, you know, my computer died. All right, so this FHA inspection request has nothing to do with the regular inspection. If you've done transactions before, you know this is required by the FHA inspector, the FHA appraiser, right? Because they might go in after and they're not there to do inspections. They're not going to do a full inspections, and appraisers there to measure the house and to get value. If they see though that let's say the garage door is falling apart, they're going to require that it gets taken care of. And the underwriter will not proceed until whatever the FHA appraiser says that needs to be done is done. Make sense?
I have a question, Ms. Authurine.
Yes.
So what happens in that blank if you put, this is something like $300 and what needs to get fixed is $500?
Oh, okay, that is fantastic, because this whole statement right here, underneath here, says anybody can pay for the difference of that. The buyer agrees to pay the excess amount.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, cool. All right. All right. And then of course the seller pays for certain lender imposed inspections. Now the lender can say, you know what, this is on a septic tank. We did not like the report that the regular inspector sent us over, or you know what, they sent us a report and we're gonna ask for another inspection to be done on the septic tank. And so this is a lender imposed inspection, and this will not go to closing until it's done, all right? This one, if you know that sewer is public water, public sewer, I just put NA in here, okay? And then this is an arm's length transaction. If you're new on arm's length, just means that we are not in any way related to each other. So if you're not related, the seller and the buyer don't know each other, neither the agent, you just put check, this is not an arm's length transaction, or this is an arm's length transaction. That's the end of that one. All right. Oh, are we going to get to amendments today? I think that is, that should be the end of that, except exhibit. Ah, here we go. Hang on, one more exhibit, and then we're going to talk about some amendments. We're going to talk about the amendment to address concerns, because everybody uses that one. Okay, let's talk about this exhibit before we move on to amendments. So this exhibit should be used every time you're selling a home and they have to sell that house. before they can buy. Now, there are agents who are running around knowing that they have to sell before they buy, and this is not attached as a part of the contract because they want to win the deal. All right, so questions, and I want everybody to answer me, right? Is any one transaction worth your reputation?
No.
Okay, so let's just go ahead and do the right thing, right? So remember, it's win-win or no deal. If you know, just be honest, because I might be the listing agent and just your honesty will help to win the deal, right? So it says buyer warrants that the buyer owns real property located 123 Main Street. And at the time of the offer, the buyer warrants that this property is going to be listed or it is currently listed, right? The buyer, here's the closing date, right? Here's how much it closes for. Or if the buyer is leasing their property. Now this, if the buyer is leasing the property, this becomes a lender issue because they're going to want to see a fully executed lease, right? So you would get a copy of the lease. Of course, the seller would like to see that, send it over to the listing agent, and then of course the fully executed lease would go over to the buyer's lender. Here's a kickout clause. There used to be a date and there still is in here. A kickout clause says, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, if you get a different offer that's better than mine and we're on the contract, you can kick me out. Well, if it's my buyer, guess what I'm ticking? I'm ticking option number 1. This agreement is not, well, I'm not ticking that. Ticking number 2. This agreement is not subject to a kickout clause, okay? Because I want to make sure that I'm really on the contract and I want to stay on the contract. If you're the seller's agent, though, you might want to say, hey, we're on the contract and guess what? I want a kickout clause because if you're taking 60, 75 days to close and somebody else comes in and it's a cash offer, I want you to remove this contingency or back out, right? So if you're the seller's agent, option 1 works in your behalf. If you're the buyer's agent, always tick option number 2. So it's not subject to somebody else coming in and getting your house. Understood? Yes. Yes?
Yep.
All right, very good. Let's go look on amendment to address concerns. All right, where are we? Amendment to sales price, amendment to address concerns. Oh, here we go. All right. Somebody tell me the time. I'm having so much fun on my birthday. I'm not even looking at it. Oh my goodness. Oh gosh, we had so much fun. All right, so I'm gonna hurry through this one. Okay, so amendment to address concerned, any kind of amendment. Okay, so what is an amendment, Authurine? An amendment is anything that you use with a binded contract to change the terms of the contract. Yes? Yes and yes. So this one, so this amendment to address concerns, we're only going to use it if the property had a due diligence period, right? And the due diligence period is when we run around, do our inspections, rate and test, blah, 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 all of that. So once you get the inspection report, the conversation again for my new biz with your buyer is, listen, you're paying money to the inspector. The inspector is going to find something wrong. That is their job. We're going to ask for big things like structural. We're going to ask for a roof if the house is falling down. We are not going to ask for a little blind that we can go buy a $7 blind, right? That is not going to be on the inspection, on the amendment to address concerns. So this says that there's money passing hands in consideration of the sum of $10 and other good and marketable services. Valuable consideration is given. May I tell you that this $10 have never passed hands in all the times that I've been in real estate. So I always get this question, right? If I am the seller's agent, I want the due diligence to end. If we're negotiating amendment, otherwise known as the ATAC, the amendment to address concerns with the property, right? Once we've talked about everything and we've agreed what we're gonna fix and not fix, I want the due diligence as the seller's agent to end. As the buyer's agent, I am ticking shall not terminate. I might go back over there and find something else with the plumber or the termite inspector. Does that make sense? Right. So always wear two hats, right? If you're the seller's agent, it needs to terminate, right? Buyer's agent, I am not terminating it. And here's something I must say, you guys, right? Put on both hats. If you're the seller's agent or the buyer's agent, buyer agents, please don't send me the ATAC on the last day of due diligence. There's nothing I can do. Please give enough time for us to go out and get some quotes, all right? Because if you send this in the last day and we haven't had enough time to go out and you don't hear back from us, with like, let's say 9 o'clock at night, guess what, as a buyer's agent, you need to be doing right away? Well, let me ask it. As the buyer's agent, if you have not heard back from me as the listing agent by 9 o'clock at night, what should you be doing immediately?
Unilateral extension or something like that?
Yes, you can do that. You can extend the due diligence date, or you can terminate the contract. And usually if you send over a termination of contract and we really don't want to terminate, you are going to get a response. Be careful with that though, right? Don't just run to send over termination of contract. Ask for an extension if you really want the house, because the seller might go, you know what? I'm not doing anything. Let him terminate the contract. I got another contract, $25,000 waiting in the wings for you to terminate. So always be in communication, okay? Questions on this? I'm gonna stop share and give me some feedback and I'll let you go. Thank you for being on for so long. Wow, I guess I explained everything beautifully because nobody has any questions.
I have a question. So if you really do want the house, is it a good idea to use the amendment to address concerns? If you really want the house and then they have other, you know, offers in the wings.
Yeah, I would. And here's, okay, so here's my conversation at the dining table when I'm taking the listing. Mr. Seller, they're gonna pay $500 to $600 to do an inspection. Please don't get mad when the inspection report comes back, because if the inspector comes out and there's nothing wrong, the buyer's gonna feel like, you know, they throw away their money. So here's what we will do, Mr. Seller. When you are in Arizona, I do not want to get the call saying something was not fixed properly. We'll look at the inspection report and what they're asking us to fix, and then we'll come up with a dollar amount and propose that. We'll counter with money instead of you taking in the job to go supervise contractors, right? So I always say, just fix it with money. On the buyer side too, I go, hey, let's get a dollar amount where you hire your own contractors, right? So now you get to supervise your contractors and you get the job done the way you want it done, right? Because they might go get a handyman to do a plumbing issue and you don't really want a handyman to fix a plumbing issue, do you, Mr. Buyer? And it's usually no, because you want a licensed contractor plumber to do that work. So always I always say to both sides, let's get money and you have it done. What that does for you guys too, it takes, when you're finished with that transaction, the only thing you should be really doing is following up with your buyer and seller, caring for them, you know, visiting, sending them invitations. You should not be in the middle of a dispute about something not getting fixed properly. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. All right. And that's my adieu for today. Thank you for being here. It means a lot to me that you would take time out of your busy schedule to spend an afternoon with me.
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. See you around
Thank
later.
you, Authurine. Happy birthday.
Thank you. You're welcome. Bye, guys.
Thank you.